200 people were watching, and not one of them stood up to stop her. The ballroom of the Fairmount Hotel in downtown Chicago was full of black suits and quiet money that night, and at the head table sat Cassian Barone, 34 years old, a man whose name alone could shut down half the docks on Lake Michigan. Nobody interrupted a man like that. Nobody even looked at him too long. Then the doors at the back opened, and a woman walked in, who didn't belong in that room at all. 27 years old, heavyset, wearing a red dress that clearly wasn't hers, flat shoes soaked through from the rain outside, her hair coming loose. Somebody laughed. Somebody said something about the dress, loud enough to be heard. She kept walking anyway, all the way down the length of that ballroom, past every single person who'd decided she wasn't worth stopping. She stopped behind his chair. He looked up, and in front of 200 witnesses, she took hold of his lapels and kissed him. A glass hit the floor. Somebody screamed. And when Cassian Barone finally spoke, his voice wasn't angry at all. It was shaking. You have no idea what you've just done. If you believe a person's worth was never measured in dress sizes, hit that like button, share this with someone who's been underestimated their whole life, and subscribe, because this is a story that deserves to be heard. Now let's go back 3 weeks, to a rainy night in the medical records room beneath St. Ambrose Hospital, and find out how a woman like her ended up in that ballroom. 3 weeks earlier, on a night when the rain was pouring down in sheets, Greta Novak was standing in the ground floor emergency room at St. Ambrose Hospital when her pager vibrated for the 4th time during her shift. She was a sign language interpreter who worked nights, and rainy nights were always longer than the others. More people fell, more people arrived late, and those who couldn't hear always arrived last, because they had to wait for someone willing to take them. In the 3rd examination room, an elderly woman with silver hair as fine as mist sat on the edge of the bed, her right hand wrapped in a temporary bandage, rainwater still clinging to the leg of her pants. The old woman kept signing with urgent, frantic movements, and no one in the room understood what she was saying. The doctor on duty held out a sheet of paper, but she shook her head. A nurse tried writing in larger letters, but the woman shook her head again. Huddled in the corner of the room was a young woman, perhaps no older than a college student, her eyes red, both hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Greta walked in, and the first thing she did wasn't open her notebook. She pulled the curtain closed to soften the noise. Then she sat down at the old woman's eye level, in the very position no one else in the room had thought to take. The woman's hands became still. Greta began to sign slowly, using the standard language she had spent years learning through her work. The woman stared at her in confusion, then shook her head for the 3rd time. From the corner, her granddaughter murmured, "My grandmother doesn't know sign language. She only knows a few signs I made up myself. I'm sorry, I didn't know they weren't the same." Greta turned to look at the girl, and for a moment, she saw something very old and familiar. Some families had a person who couldn't hear, yet no one had ever taught them how to speak, so the people inside those homes created a language of their own. A stroke across the cheek meant mother. 2 fingers tapping the wrist meant it was time to take medicine. A palm turned downward, and then opened, meant, don't be afraid. No book recorded those signs. No school taught them. And beyond those 4 walls, no one in the world could understand them. People in her profession called it home sign. Greta had grown up speaking that very language, and she was the one who had invented it. She turned back to the old woman, and this time, she didn't use standard sign language. She glanced at the granddaughter, nodded, and said softly, "You do it. You speak to your grandmother, and I'll watch." Hesitantly, the girl raised one hand and made an awkward gesture, brushing her thumb across her eyebrow. The old woman answered immediately. Greta watched the 2 of them for several minutes. She didn't interrupt or interfere. She only watched, the way a person reading a book studies an unfamiliar page, until every mark slowly begins to carry meaning. Then she began to interpret. The old woman's hand wasn't hurting. The pain was in her left hip, and she had refused to say anything because she was afraid they would keep her overnight, and her granddaughter had to leave early for work that morning. The doctor on duty looked up and asked again to be certain, then immediately changed the imaging order. Half an hour later, when the results came back, the fracture was exactly where Greta had said it would be. As the old woman's bed was being wheeled away, her granddaughter caught Greta by the hand and asked a question she would remember for a very long time. "Those signs I made up, are they wrong?" Greta took the girl's trembling hands in hers and said, "No, they're the language you created so you could reach your grandmother." but you have to teach them to other people too, or one day, you'll be the only person left who can understand her." The girl nodded through her tears, then hurried after the bed. Close to 1 o'clock in the morning, Greta went down to the records room in the basement, where she worked extra shifts, filing documents on quiet nights to make up for the income that interpreting alone couldn't provide. The heater gurgled in the corner. She sat down, opened her wallet, and counted. A few small bills, the last large denomination bill she had left, and 2 invoices folded into quarters so many times that the creases were beginning to tear. Tomorrow was her mother's dialysis day. The money in Greta's wallet wasn't enough. It had never been enough. She closed the wallet, set it on the table, pulled the stack of files toward her, and began to work, because that was the only thing she knew how to do when everything else lay beyond her reach. Greta didn't hear the door open. That was the first thing that made her look up, because the basement door was so old that every time someone pushed it open, its hinges released a long, piercing squeal, and everyone in the hospital knew that sound. But tonight, there had been no sound at all. There was only a man standing at the end of the row of shelves, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, watching her as though he had been there for a long time, waiting for her to notice him on her own. He wasn't wearing hospital clothes, he had no visitor's badge, and he didn't look like a family member who had lost his way in the middle of the night. The dark suit fit him so perfectly that it seemed to have been tailored for this very moment. Behind him, out in the hallway, 2 figures stood motionless, and neither of them stepped inside. Greta set down her pen. "Are you looking for someone?" she asked. The man approached slowly, and she noticed that his shoes made no sound against the concrete floor. He stopped on the other side of the filing table, then placed a thick envelope and a pre-printed document on its surface. "I'm looking for you," he said. His voice was very quiet. It wasn't the quiet voice of someone trying to remain courteous inside a hospital. It was the quiet voice of a man accustomed to having an entire room fall silent so it could hear him speak. "My name is Cassian Barone." Greta knew that name. Anyone who had lived in this city long enough knew it. In the same way people knew the name of a storm that had passed years ago but had left its scars upon the walls of their homes. She looked at the document. It wasn't a request for medical records, a letter of authorization, or anything she had ever encountered in her work. It was an affidavit, neatly typed, with exactly 1 blank line at the bottom for her signature. In that affidavit, she would confirm that on the night she had been called to the 4th floor to interpret for a patient who couldn't speak, she hadn't been qualified to provide an accurate interpretation, that she wasn't certain of what she had interpreted, and that she was withdrawing her certification. Greta read it to the end, then read it again, and throughout that time, Cassian Barone didn't say a word. He merely stood there and watched her read. "You want me to sign this?" she said. "I want you to sign it," he replied. "Then you'll never have to hear my name again, and I'll never have to hear yours." Greta pushed the document back toward the center of the table. "And the envelope?" she asked. "That's so you won't have to ask any more questions," he said. She straightened in her chair. "Do you know what I did in that room?" she said. "I sat beside the bed of a man who had lost the ability to speak and the ability to hold a pen. There was a lawyer present. There was a notary present. There was a hospital representative present. I interpreted every sentence. Someone typed every sentence, then read it aloud to him, and he placed his fingerprint beneath it. I signed my name below because that was my job, and because what I interpreted was true." Cassian didn't blink. "My father lost his voice before he lost his life," he said, still speaking in that same quiet tone. "For the last 3 weeks, he couldn't say a single word to me. Not one word. Then he died. And they handed me a piece of paper with his fingerprint at the bottom. And the only thing that gives that paper any value is the word of a stranger who claims she understood him, waving his hands." He paused. "Tell me, what am I supposed to trust about that?" Greta remained silent for a moment. Outside, the rain continued to beat against the narrow window near the ceiling. "You think everything in this world carries a price tag because you've never had to pay with anything other than money," Greta said, stepping back from the desk. "Keep your check, Mr. Barone. Some truths aren't for sale." This time, Cassian looked at her, truly looked at her, with the expression of a man who had just heard an unfamiliar sound inside the house where he had lived his entire life. He picked up the document, folded it in half, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. He left the envelope where it was on the table. "Keep it," he said as he turned away. Then he stopped at the end of the row of shelves without looking back. "You'll change your mind," he said. "Everyone does." And the door closed behind him without making a single sound. The following morning, on the highest floor of the building that bore the family name, a man was shouting. He was the contractor for a waterfront development. His face flushed red, both hands pressed so hard against the long table that every blow echoed through the room. He said promises had been made to him, that he had poured money into the project all season, and that he wasn't the kind of man who would allow someone who had only just taken his father's place to push him around. 7 or 8 people sat around the table, and not one of them looked up. At the head of the table, Cassian Barone said nothing for 4 full minutes. He listened to everything. Then he reached for the water pitcher, poured a glass, and gently pushed it toward the other man. The glass slid across the polished wood and stopped directly in front of him. "Have some water first," Cassian said. His voice was so quiet that the person seated at the far end of the table had to lean forward. The man didn't drink. Cassian folded his hands together. "Your loan at the bank on LaSalle Street is about to come due," he said. "I've sat on the board of that bank since before I was permitted to sit at this table." He paused for a moment. "You may continue raising your voice. It doesn't bother me. But someone from that bank will call you this afternoon, and I think when that happens, you'll wish you still had a voice left." The room fell completely silent. The man remained standing for several more seconds, both hands still braced against the table, then slowly lowered himself into his chair. He picked up the glass of water and drank. No one said anything else until the meeting ended, and when everyone began filing out, not one person dared to pass the end of the table where Cassian sat. Only one man remained behind. Sal Marchetti was past 60 now, his hair silver, his steps a little slower than they once had been, and he still kept the habit of patting Cassian on the shoulder whenever he walked past him, the way a man might pat the shoulder of a nephew who had grown up long ago but would always remain a child in his eyes. He pulled out the chair beside Cassian, sat down, and poured himself a glass of water from the same pitcher. "You did well," Sal said. "Your father did exactly the same thing when he was young." Cassian didn't answer. Sal slowly turned the glass in his hand. "I heard you went down to the hospital last night," he said. Cassian continued looking through the window, where the lake below had turned gray beneath the wind. "I wanted to hear what she had to say," he replied. "And what did she say?" "She said she wasn't for sale." Sal gave a quiet laugh, gentle and almost pitying. "Everyone says that the first time," he said. Then he set down his glass. "Son, let me tell you something, because there's no one left but me who dares to say it. During your father's final 3 weeks in that bed, he couldn't speak a single word. I visited him, he looked at me, he moved his hands, and I didn't understand a thing. You visited him, he moved his hands, and you didn't understand either. Then suddenly, a complete stranger who had never met anyone in this family walked into the room and claimed she understood him. I'm asking you, does that seem normal?" Cassian turned to look at him. "What do you think?" "I don't think anything," Sal said, his voice still warm, as though he were telling an old story. "I've simply been in this business too long, and I've learned one thing. There's always someone waiting beside the bed of a dying man. Not because they care, but because it's the easiest place in this entire city to profit." He stood, then patted Cassian on the shoulder once more. "Do whatever you need to do, but don't let anyone use your father's name as a joke." That afternoon, Dale Pruitt summoned Greta to the Records Administration office and didn't invite her to sit down. He stood behind his desk, straightening a stack of papers that was already perfectly aligned, then straightened it again. "There's been a complaint," he said. "About what?" Greta asked. "About your accepting an interpreting assignment when your name wasn't on the duty roster that night." Greta looked at him. "I was called upstairs," she said. "My name is in the shift log. My pager number is there." Dale still didn't look up. "I know," he said. "But if you submit your resignation voluntarily, I can still preserve your letter of recommendation. If they're allowed to handle this their way, I won't be able to preserve anything." Greta stood there for a long time, long enough that he was forced to find something for his hands to do. "How much did they pay you?" she asked. Dale didn't answer. He didn't look at her either. Not once from beginning to end. Not even when she placed her employee badge on his desk and walked out. It was still raining when she reached the aging apartment building in Avondale. The kind of persistent late autumn rain that left even the shared hallways cold and damp. She had just unlocked her door when the door to the neighboring apartment opened a few inches, and Mrs. Ruth peered out, holding a container of hot soup with a thin envelope tucked beneath it. The old woman said she had cooked too much and couldn't finish it all, then added that she was old now and had no use for keeping money in the house. Greta accepted the soup, thanked her, and gently pressed the envelope back into the old woman's hand before closing the door. Inside the apartment, she didn't turn on all the lights. She set the soup on the stove, removed her wet coat, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dim glow filtering in from the street. On the small shelf beside the bed stood a framed photograph she never turned face down. In it was Milo, her younger brother, wearing a knit cap tilted to one side and grinning broadly, one hand raised in a sign only the two of them understood. His index and middle fingers touched his temple lightly, then flicked outward. It meant big sister. She remembered the day that photograph was taken. It had been hot, and the two of them had sat on the front steps of their home. Milo had insisted that she invent a sign for his favorite ice cream, then another sign for eating two at once, then one more for not telling their mother. They had spent that entire afternoon creating a language only two people in the world knew how to speak, laughing so hard that their neighbor had poked her head outside to see what was happening. Milo had been gone for 7 years now, and with him, that language had lost the only other person who could speak it. Greta sat motionless for a very long time, until the soup on the stove had gone completely cold. She thought about the neatly typed document with one blank line at the bottom, and about the man who had placed it on the table without making a sound. She thought about that night on the 4th floor, about the trembling hands of the man who couldn't speak, about the slow gestures he had tried to repeat again and again, until she nodded so he would know she understood. She thought that no one in his life had ever asked him a question and been willing to wait for his answer. Then the telephone rang. It was the hospital, Greta answered, and the person on the other end spoke quickly and concisely, in the voice people used only after they had been forced to deliver the same message many times in a single day. Danuta Novak had just been transferred to a special observation unit. Her numbers weren't good. Tomorrow's dialysis treatment would have to be postponed so they could perform additional tests. Greta should come immediately if she could arrange it. Greta stood, reached for the coat that was still soaking wet where it hung over the back of the chair, and before walking out the door, she looked once more at the wallet lying on the table. She knew exactly how much money remained inside. She picked it up and left. The woman waiting for Greta in the 3rd floor hallway outside the special observation unit had been sitting there for no one knew how long, a leather briefcase resting on her lap. She introduced herself as Loretta Pike, the attorney responsible for authenticating the estate, and apologized for approaching Greta in a place like this at an hour like this. But she said plainly that she didn't have much time left, and neither did Greta. The two women sat down in a pair of plastic chairs at the end of the hallway. "Do you know what you signed?" Loretta asked. "I signed as the interpreter," Greta replied. "I do that a dozen times every month." "No," Loretta said. This time was different. She opened her briefcase and removed a stack of papers, but didn't hand them to Greta. She merely rested them on her own lap. "People assume that what gives a will its validity is the signature of the person who made it," she said. "But Mr. Barone couldn't sign. He couldn't speak, and he couldn't hold a pen. What he left behind was a fingerprint. A fingerprint alone says nothing. It only proves that a hand touched the paper. The only thing proving that the hand understood what it was touching. The only thing connecting the wishes inside the deceased man's mind to the typed words on that page is the interpreter's certification." "Yours." Greta sat motionless. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means that if you withdraw your testimony," Loretta replied, "that entire document will cease to be a will. It will become nothing more than a sheet of paper bearing the fingerprint of a gravely ill man. The court won't recognize it. And if the court doesn't recognize it, everything reverts to the previous will, the one he prepared many years ago, the one he spent the final days of his life trying to change." Loretta looked directly into her eyes. "Someone desperately wants you to withdraw your testimony." "I know," Greta said. "They've already come to me." "Then there's something else you should know," Loretta said. "The probate hearing will begin soon. Until that day, as long as your testimony remains unchanged, the will remains alive. After that day, everything will be settled, and no one will be able to touch it. The time in between is the most dangerous period, and I came here to tell you one thing. From now until then, be careful." She stood, placed her business card on the empty chair beside Greta, and walked away. Greta remained alone in the hallway. Through the small window in the door, she could see her mother sleeping, one thin arm resting outside the blanket. She thought about another man who had once lain just like that on the 4th floor of this very building, a man who had used his final breaths not to give instructions about money, but to struggle to say something that mattered, slowly and awkwardly, again and again, until a stranger was willing to sit down and wait. Greta had spent her entire life speaking for people like him. She had never abandoned anyone halfway through. Greta pulled a business card from her coat pocket, but it wasn't Loretta's. It was the card she had picked up from the basement table after the other visitor left, the only thing he had placed beside the envelope she had refused to touch. She dialed the number. The telephone rang exactly twice. "I knew you would call," his voice said, as quiet as it had been the night before. "I'm not signing anything," Greta said. "You can keep your envelope. I'm calling about something else." He fell silent. "I want to see with my own eyes the family your father used his final breaths to speak about," she said. "Send a car for me." They left Greta waiting in a small room overlooking the back garden, and she sat there for quite a long time, long enough to understand that making her wait was another way of speaking to her. The house was silent in the peculiar way that houses become silent when they are too large, when every sound is swallowed before it has a chance to echo. Across the garden stood a large greenhouse with walls made entirely of glass from floor to ceiling, and there was a light burning inside. Greta hadn't intended to look. But then she saw 2 people in there. A young woman in a sweater with long sleeves sat on a wooden chair, holding a notebook. She hurriedly wrote a few words and held them up. The woman standing across from her, who appeared to be a member of the household staff, bent down to read them, nodded, then said something aloud. The young woman shook her head and continued writing. The other woman glanced at her watch. The young woman wrote faster, and her handwriting must have grown worse, because she had to point to each line. The woman read only halfway through before waving one hand, smiling the way people smiled when they wanted to end a conversation, then turning and walking straight toward the door. The young woman remained there alone, the notebook open on her lap, and the pen still in her hand. Greta stood. She didn't think about whose house she was in, or why she had been invited there. She knew only that she had just watched someone being abandoned in the middle of a sentence, and that was the one thing in this world she couldn't bear. She walked around the hallway, pushed open the greenhouse door, and stepped inside. The air was warm and damp, carrying the faint scent of soil. The young woman's head snapped up, her hand tightening around the notebook, her eyes holding the wary expression of someone far too accustomed to strangers walking in and saying things she couldn't hear. Greta didn't open her mouth. She pulled over a chair, sat at the young woman's eye level, and gently pushed the notebook and pen aside on the table. Then she raised both hands. "Hello?" she signed. "My name is Greta." The pen fell from the young woman's hand and rolled across the tiled floor. She didn't pick it up. She sat perfectly still, her eyes wide, staring at Greta's hands as though she were looking at something she had once dreamed of, but had never believed could truly exist. Then her shoulders began to tremble. "I can hear you," the young woman signed, her hands shaking, several of her gestures imperfect, one hand colliding with the other. "I can hear you." Greta nodded, smiled, and signed back very slowly. "I can hear you too." The young woman burst into tears, but they weren't the tears of someone in pain. She cried and laughed at the same time, wiping away her tears while hurriedly raising her hands to continue, as though the woman sitting across from her might disappear if she waited even a second. "My name is Nadia," she said. "Nadia Barone. Where did you learn this? Is this your profession? How long have you been doing it? Do you speak to other people this way every day? Do people out there speak to one another like this?" Greta answered every question, one at a time, and whenever she finished answering, Nadia laughed again, the laughter of someone who had just been released from a room where she had been confined for far too long. Nadia told her that she had lost her hearing when she was very young, and no one in the family had known what to do. They hired tutors to teach her to read and write, forced her through endless speech therapy and lip-reading lessons, bought her books, bought her devices, and took her from one doctor to another. "My family isn't cruel," she said. "They simply didn't know what to do. They bought me everything except someone who knew how to listen to me. Only my father was willing to move his hands with me, and he invented those signs himself because no one had ever taught him. My father and I spoke to each other in a language unlike anyone else's." Then she lowered her gaze slightly and added, "My father is gone now." Greta didn't say anything. She simply reached out her hand, and Nadia took it. The two women remained in that greenhouse for 2 full hours. Outside, the sky gradually darkened. The garden lights came on, and no one entered to call them away. On the other side of the glass, Cassian Barone stood beneath a tree with his hands in his pockets, watching. He watched his sister laugh. He watched the two women speak to each other through movements of which he couldn't understand a single word, and he remained there for a very long time, on the other side of the glass, in a garden that belonged to him. When Greta stepped out of the greenhouse, he was standing directly outside the door. He said nothing about what he had just witnessed. He merely said, "Please come inside," then turned and walked ahead of her. The study was at the end of the hallway, with books covering 3 walls, and on the writing desk there was nothing but a thin leather checkbook and a pen. Cassian closed the door. "My sister has never sat with anyone for that long," he said. "No one has ever been willing to sit with her for that long," Greta replied. He didn't answer. He pulled the checkbook toward himself, opened it, and began to write. Greta watched the pen move across the paper, and she understood what it was even before he tore the check free. He placed it on the desk, turned it so she could read it, then pushed it toward her. She looked at the number. She had spent her entire life looking at numbers, on bills, on receipts, on the small sheets of paper the hospital handed her whenever her mother completed a dialysis treatment, and she knew exactly what this number meant. It meant everything would be over. It meant there would be no more envelopes folded into quarters inside her wallet. No more nights spent working in the records room to make up for what her salary couldn't cover. No more standing in hospital hallways trying to calculate where next month's money would come from. Greta looked up. "You're paying me to say I didn't understand something I did understand," she said. "I'm paying you to end something that should never have begun," Cassian replied. "Do you think I'm doing this because of the port? I could lose that port and still sleep soundly." "Then what are you afraid of?" He said nothing. "You aren't afraid of losing the port," Greta said. "You're afraid that your father really did manage to say something, and the person who heard him wasn't you." The pen in Cassian's hand became still. For a moment, his face could no longer hold the calm expression he wore like a coat, and what appeared beneath it wasn't anger, but something far more exposed. Then he rose abruptly. "You know nothing," he said, and for the first time, his voice broke free of the whisper he had maintained for so many years, growing so loud that even he stopped for half a second. "How long did you sit in that room? 1 hour? 2 hours? I sat there for 3 weeks. 3 weeks, do you understand? Every day. And then you walked in and told me you could hear him." Greta didn't retreat. She remained seated, both hands resting in her lap. "I didn't tell you I could hear him," she said. "I told you I was willing to wait for him. Those are 2 different things, and you could have done the second without learning anything at all." The room remained silent for a very long time. Cassian stood with his back to her, staring through the dark window, and when he turned around, that coat had been drawn back into place, smooth and immaculate, as though it had never been disturbed. He picked up the pen. He didn't say another word. He merely pulled the check back, wrote on it again, then slowly pushed it toward her with the tips of 2 fingers. "Everyone has a price," he said. "You simply haven't heard the right number yet." Greta looked down. Then she stood. She didn't pick up the check, fold it, push it back toward him, or say another word about it. She left it exactly where he had placed it, facing upward, the number exposed in the middle of the empty desk. She reached for her coat on the back of the chair. "Thank you for sending a car for me," she said. "But I didn't come here to see you. I came to see the family your father spoke about with his final breaths, and now I've seen it." Then she walked out, closed the door behind her, and the sound of her footsteps rang clearly along the hallway, a language that House hadn't heard in a very long time. The next morning, Greta went to the diner on the corner of Milwaukee Avenue, the place where she had been sitting since her school days, where they refilled her coffee without asking. She ordered eggs and toast, opened her notebook, and tried to do the one thing she had promised herself she would somehow manage, which was to live through an ordinary morning. She had eaten only a few bites when someone pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without asking. The man was around 40, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a leather jacket. The first thing Greta noticed was his left hand resting on the table. The top joint of his ring finger was missing, and the stump had healed into a smooth, rounded nub. He smiled, revealing a crooked row of lower teeth. "Enjoying your breakfast?" he said. His voice was harsh and raspy, the voice of a man who had been smoking since he was young, and he drew out the final word of every sentence as though savoring it. Then he slowly and deliberately looked her up and down and made a remark about her body. One he delivered loudly enough for the people at the next table to hear, before laughing at his own joke. Greta set down her fork. "You've chosen the wrong table," she said. "No, I haven't," he replied. "Someone wants to speak with you. The place isn't far from here. You come with me for a little while, then I'll bring you back. Easy." "I'm not going anywhere," Greta said. The man sighed as though she had made things difficult for him, then reached across the table and closed his hand around her wrist. His grip was cold and firm, and the shortened finger pressed into her skin. Greta didn't cry out for help. Life had taught her that once people decided she was something they could drag away, screaming only made those around her turn their faces aside to avoid the discomfort. She did 3 things almost at once. With her free hand, she grabbed the full cup of coffee and threw it straight against his chest. It had just been refilled and was still hot. He jerked backward, loosening his grip. At the same time, she drove all her weight through the heel of her shoe and brought it down on the top of his foot. Greta was a large woman. She knew exactly how much she weighed, and she had never apologized to anyone for it. The man howled. Then Greta sprang to her feet, raised both hands beside her head, and shouted. She shouted aloud with all the force in her voice while signing at the same time, her movements sharp, wide, and commanding every inch of space around her. It was the signal she had taught to so many people in so many emergency rooms, the signal designed to make every head in the room turn. "This man is holding my arm," she shouted. "Everyone, look here." The entire diner turned toward them. The man pouring coffee froze behind the counter. 2 workmen at the back table stood. An elderly woman near the window pulled out her telephone and raised it. The man released Greta as though he had been holding a burning coal. At that exact moment, the diner door opened. Greta didn't see Cassian enter. She saw only the daylight spilling in from the street and then being blocked. And she saw the expression on the face of the man before her change. The expression of an animal that had just heard footsteps behind it. A chair fell over. 2 men swept past Greta's table. Then the diner door closed. And outside, beyond the glass clouded with steam, something happened quickly and efficiently. But Greta didn't turn around to watch. Inside the diner, people slowly returned to their seats, and the man who poured the coffee began wiping the counter as though his hands needed something to do. Cassian stood beside Greta's table. He didn't ask whether she was all right. "I could handle it myself," Greta said, and her voice trembled, which she hated. "I know," he replied. "I saw. Then why are you here?" Cassian took the chair where the other man had been sitting, lifted it, and placed it neatly back where it belonged. "I didn't come to save you," he said. "I came so they would see me standing beside you." That afternoon he drove her home, and along the way he held out his telephone. "It's done," he said. "You don't have to think about it anymore." On the screen was the name of a man Greta had spent the past year trying to forget. Someone who had once worked the same shift as she did, who had secretly recorded her eating lunch alone in the records room and posted the video online with a joke, and then hundreds of thousands of strangers had laughed. Beneath his name were 3 brief lines: terminated from both jobs, apartment lease canceled, bank loan denied. "No one laid a finger on him," Cassian said. "There's nothing anyone can sue anyone over." Greta stared at the screen for a long time, and what she felt wasn't relief. "Did you ask me?" she said. "What? Did you ask me a single question before you did this?" He frowned, genuinely unable to understand. "He humiliated you in front of an ocean of people." "And I survived," Greta said. "I still went to work the next morning. I still walked through that hallway, with my head held high every day, until people grew bored. I don't need anyone to win my battles for me." She turned to look at him. "You deal with people by erasing them," she said. "You don't strike them or threaten them. You simply erase them, so cleanly that they don't even know who did it or what was done to them. You did it to the man in the diner this morning. You did it to this man. One day, Cassian, you'll decide that I'm inconvenient. How will you erase me when that day comes?" The car stopped in front of the aging apartment building in Avondale. He didn't answer. She opened the door, stepped out, walked straight inside, and didn't look back. Near midnight, someone knocked on her door. Greta looked through the peephole and saw him standing there alone, with no car and no one accompanying him. The collar of his coat turned up against the wind, in a hallway where he had never set foot in his life. She opened the door but didn't invite him inside. He stood beyond the threshold, and he didn't apologize. She would realize later that he hadn't withheld those words out of pride. He genuinely didn't know how to say them. No one had ever taught him, and in the language in which he had been raised, people made amends with money or with silence. He said only 2 words, "Teach me." Greta looked at him for a long moment, then opened the door wider. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table beneath the only light she had turned on. She placed both hands on the table. "Only 3, she said. 3 tonight." For the first sign, she raised a fist to her chest and slowly moved it in a circle. "I'm sorry." He imitated her. "Wrong." She corrected him. He tried again. Still wrong. For the second sign, she touched 2 fingers together, then lowered them. "Brother." He copied her. And this time, the large hand accustomed to holding the pen that signed papers capable of changing an entire city became so clumsy that even he had to look down at it. For the third sign, she turned her palm downward and gently pressed it into the space before her twice. "I'm here." He made more mistakes with this sign than with either of the others. He tried again and then again, and Greta counted 7 attempts before he was still getting it wrong. On the 8th attempt, his hand trembled. He lowered it, rested it on the table, and stared at it as though it belonged to someone else. Then he began to speak, and his voice remained as quiet as ever, except this time, the quietness no longer carried power. During the final 3 weeks, he said, he kept moving his hands. He repeated the same series of gestures again and again, all while looking at me. I sat there. I didn't understand anything. I told the nurses to increase his medication. I told the doctors to examine him again. I sent people to find the best physician in the state. No one told me that what he was doing was a language. Everyone told me he was agitated. He paused. On the final night, he continued, he moved his hands again. They were so weak by then, but he kept trying, and I was tired. I had been sitting there for 3 weeks. I thought he was in pain. I took both his hands in mine and held them down. I told him, "Stop, Father. Rest. We can do this tomorrow." Cassian raised his eyes to Greta. "I told my father to be quiet," he said. Those were the last words I ever spoke to him. 3 days later, Greta returned to the greenhouse, this time because Nadia herself had sent a message asking her to come. The 2 women sat at the wooden table among the potted plants, and Greta opened the notebook she had carried with her since that night at the hospital. "I need you to teach me how to speak the way your father did," she signed. Nadia nodded and began. She raised one hand and traced a small circle beside her temple, which meant remember. She brought all 5 fingertips together, then spread them open, which meant money. She placed one hand over the other, then separated them as though opening a book, which meant documents. She tapped the edge of the table twice, which meant old house. None of those gestures resembled standard signs, and Greta recorded them one by one, drawing the position of the hands beside each one, exactly as she had done as a child with the signs Milo invented. "Did your father create all of these himself?" Greta asked. Nadia's hands became still. Then she told her the story. When she was little, her father had been the only person in the family willing to sit down and move his hands with her, and the first signs had indeed been ones he invented himself. But in recent years, something had changed. He began signing more correctly. He knew signs he had never known before. Once, Nadia asked where he had learned them, but he merely smiled and told her he had remembered them. Then one evening, she found a student identification card in his desk drawer from the community center on Kedzie Street, for a night class held twice a week. His photograph was on the card, but the name printed beneath it wasn't his. Nadia began signing more slowly. "I took the card to my father and asked him about it," she said. He sat in silence for a very long time. Then he told me, "Don't tell your brother. Don't tell anyone." I asked him why. He said that he had spent his entire life forcing people to listen whenever he spoke. Yet there was one person in his own family to whom he had never managed to say a single decent sentence. He said he was ashamed. He said, "Let me finish learning first. Then you and I will have one proper conversation." Greta set down her pen. She sat quietly, listening to water dripping somewhere inside the greenhouse. Then she turned her notebook to the final page, where she had recorded everything from that night on the 4th floor, and began repeating each gesture in front of Nadia. She had been able to interpret the first part that night because he had used standard signs. The second part was different. Halfway through, he had shifted entirely into the private language of his own family. Greta raised her hands and began the first sequence, and Nadia burst into tears before she had finished. "Father was speaking to me," Nadia signed, tears running down her chin. "He said, 'You aren't my shame. You're the only thing I ever did right.'" Greta let her cry for a while, then performed the second sequence. Nadia wiped her face, watched closely, then translated it piece by piece. Documents. Old house. The piano bench. The one with a lid that opens. Underneath it. Greta wrote everything down, her hand trembling slightly. Then she performed the third sequence, the last one, which consisted of only 3 gestures. He had placed his right hand flat against the left side of his chest, held it there for 1 beat, then lowered it and opened his palm toward the space in front of him. Nadia watched intently. She asked Greta to repeat it. Greta did. Nadia remained silent for a very long time. "This is someone's name sign," she finally said. "My family created a separate sign for every person. Everyone has one." "Whose name is this?" Greta asked. "I don't know," Nadia replied. "Father created it a very long time ago, when I was still very small. He taught it to me, but he never told me who it referred to. I've never met that person." "And what do the other 2 gestures mean?" Greta asked. Nadia raised her hands and repeated them to be certain, then translated. "Tell that person Father is sorry." That afternoon, when Greta left, Cassian was waiting for her at the end of the driveway. He asked whether she had made any progress, and Greta told him about the student card, the night class on Kedzie Street, and the name printed on it that wasn't his father's. He listened to everything. He didn't ask another question or allow his expression to change. He merely gave a faint nod and wished her good night. But that night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the study until morning because something had been placed before him that could no longer be pushed aside. If his father had truly relearned how to speak, if he had spent month after month sitting in a night class just so that one day he could have a proper conversation, then throughout the final 3 weeks he lay in that bed, he hadn't been agitated at all. He had been speaking, and the only person in that room who had told him to be quiet was his son. Loretta Pike called Greta early in the morning, and her voice was no longer as calm as it had been the last time. The document safe in the basement records room had been opened. Nothing had been disturbed, nothing had been broken, and only one item was missing. It was the handwritten report Greta had prepared at the scene that night on the 4th floor. The paper with the time stamped in one corner, the paper on which she had written a brief note stating that the final passage consisted of private family signs and would need to be verified by someone from the household. Loretta said that without that document, when the probate hearing began and Greta stood to testify about the final passage, the opposing attorney would need to ask only one question. Had she known that before or after she first entered the Barone home? And everyone in the courtroom would believe she had invented it. Greta went to the hospital that same morning. Security showed her the footage from the basement hallway, and the recording lasted less than 2 minutes. 2 men walked inside without hurrying or looking around, moving with the confidence of people who knew no one would ask what they were doing there. The man in front was older, with closely cropped salt and pepper hair and a straight back. He had a peculiar habit of lightly touching each doorframe as he passed through it, like a man who had walked through thousands of doors in his life and had never lost the old custom. Greta recognized the man behind him immediately, even before his face entered the frame, because he raised one hand to brush back his hair, and she saw that left hand, the ring finger missing its upper joint, the healed end forming a smooth, rounded nub. He was the man who had sat across from her in the diner on Milwaukee Avenue. Greta sent the footage to Cassian. He called her back less than 10 minutes later, and for the first time since she had known him, his voice was no longer quiet. "The man in front is Rocco Sabatini," he said. "He belonged to my family before I could walk. He carried me away from my mother's coffin when I was 10 years old because I refused to leave it. Then he remained silent on the telephone for a very long time. 'Don't do anything,' he said. 'I'll handle this myself.'" That afternoon, Greta went to see Dale Pruitt. He was sitting in his car in the parking lot behind the hospital, both hands resting on the steering wheel, even though the engine was off. She knocked on the window, and he lowered it without asking what she wanted. "You gave them my work schedule," Greta said. "You gave them the access code to the basement door." Dale didn't deny it. He sat motionless, staring straight ahead at the empty lot. "My daughter has a hospital bill that an entire year of my salary couldn't pay," he said. "I tried to borrow money from everywhere. They came to me and offered me that exact amount. Not $1 more, and not $1 less. Do you know what? They knew the precise figure before I even opened my mouth." He turned to look at her. his eyes red. "Go report me," he said. "I'll sign anything you put in front of me. I won't try to defend myself." Greta stood there with her hands in the pockets of her coat, thinking of her own wallet, of the bills folded into quarters until the creases had worn thin, and of the night she had sat in the records room counting the money again and again when she already knew it wouldn't be enough. "You shouldn't have sold me," she said. "I know, but I understand why you did it. I once stood exactly where you're sitting now. The only difference was that I had nothing to sell." She pulled the car door open slightly so he could breathe more easily. "If the day ever comes when you want to give back what you took," she said, "you know where to find me." Then she turned and walked across the parking lot, and behind her, the man remained sitting in the silent car with both hands on the steering wheel for a very long time. Loretta Pike called Greta at 7 o'clock that evening, and she spoke the moment the call connected, without saying hello. "They filed papers with the court this afternoon." "What papers?" Greta asked. "A private settlement among the heirs," Loretta replied. "It means the entire family has reached an agreement among themselves, withdrawn every challenge, and asked the court to cancel the probate hearing. If that document bears every required signature, the court won't hold the hearing at all. And if there's no hearing, that will shall never be considered. It will remain buried in the court records forever." "Whose signature is still missing?" Greta asked, though she already knew the answer. "The head of the family," Loretta said. "And tonight, there's an engagement announcement party for him at the Fairmount Hotel. People don't arrange a gathering like that merely to eat and drink. Do you understand? They set out 200 chairs, so that when he puts his pen to the paper, 200 people will be sitting there to witness that everything is over." Greta rose from the kitchen table before ending the call. She opened her closet and immediately understood that she had nothing suitable to wear to a place like that. She knocked on Mrs. Ruth's door, and the old woman didn't ask a single question. She simply pulled a red dress from the bottom of her closet, one she had kept since the days when she still went dancing, pushed it into Greta's hands, then sent her out the door. Outside, the rain swept sideways across the street. The bus had just pulled away from the stop. Greta didn't wait for the next one. She ran, her flat shoes slapping against the wet sidewalk as she passed one block after another, rainwater streaming down the back of her neck, her hair coming loose from its knot. She kept running until she saw golden light pouring from the tall windows of the Fairmount Hotel. At the entrance to the ballroom, 2 men in suits stopped her. Her name wasn't on the guest list. She told them she needed to see Cassian Barone. They said, "Mr. Barone wasn't receiving anyone that evening." She told them there was a document waiting on a table inside, and that if he signed it, a dead man would be silenced for the second time. They looked her up and down, taking in the soaked red dress and the mud caked on her shoes. Then one of them turned away and laughed with the other. Greta waited until a group of guests who had arrived late swept through the entrance, then slipped inside among them. Warm air and the scent of perfume struck her face. She had taken barely a dozen steps when a woman separated herself from the crowd and blocked her path. Bianca Fiore was dressed in black, her hair arranged high above her head, and she spoke in a voice loud enough for an entire section of the ballroom to hear. She asked whether the serving staff were using the main entrance now, then looked down at Greta's red dress and made another remark, one about Greta's body, a remark she had been composing in her mind from the moment she saw Greta walk inside. Soft laughter spread through the people nearby. Greta didn't answer her. She merely looked past Bianca's shoulder toward the head table. Then she raised her voice, loud and clear, directing it straight into the center of the room. She said that a will was being buried that very night, that the man who made it had been able to speak, had truly been able to speak, and that he had spent months learning how to speak again, so he would be ready for that day. At the head of the table, Sal Marchetti slowly set down his glass and looked up at her, the gentle smile of a loving uncle still resting on his face. He raised one finger to shoulder height. "Take her outside," he said. A hand closed around Greta's elbow from behind, and she looked at Cassian. He was sitting there with a pen in his hand and the documents open before him. He looked at her. She knew he had heard every word. She knew he had spent an entire night awake in his study because of those very words. But he didn't stand. He didn't say anything. He merely sat there in silence, just as he had sat in silence for 3 weeks beside a hospital bed, just as he had remained silent throughout his life, trapped between the family that had raised him and the truth he had only just discovered. And it was that silence that broke Greta. She had spent her entire life speaking for people whose voices had been taken from them. Milo, Nadia, the man on the 4th floor, Now it was her turn to stand in the middle of a room filled with 200 people while they took her voice away, right in front of the only person who could give it back. Greta tore her elbow free and walked straight down the length of that ballroom, stopping right behind his chair. He looked up. Before anyone could intervene, she leaned down, took hold of his lapels, and pressed her lips to his a desperate, silent plea for him to break his silence. A glass hit the floor. Someone gasped. When she pulled back, Cassian stared at her, his voice shaking with an emotion no one in that room had ever heard from him before. "You have no idea what you've just done," he whispered. Before the stunned crowd could even process what had just happened, Sal Marchetti's voice shattered the silence, harsh and cold. "Take her outside. Now." The security guards lunged forward to grab Greta once more, but before their hands could touch her, Cassian stood up. He rose slowly, pushing his chair backward, and placed his pen onto the open documents. "Let her go," Cassian said, his voice ringing clearly across the quieted ballroom. The man behind Greta hesitated, his eyes shifting toward Sal. "I said take your hands off her," Cassian said. And this time his voice was loud enough to carry all the way to the final rows of chairs. The entire room heard clearly something no one there had ever heard before. The voice of that man when he no longer needed to speak softly. The hands released Greta's elbows. Sal rose from his chair, still trying to preserve his smile. The smile of an uncle accustomed to settling every problem with a few well-chosen words. "Son, sit down," he said quietly. "You and I can discuss this tomorrow." "No," Cassian replied. One word. Throughout his entire life, he had never spoken that word to the man standing before him. Not when he was 10. Not when he was 20. Not at any meeting table during the more than 10 years he had sat at its head and still glanced towards Sal for a nod of approval. Now he spoke that word, and he spoke it before 200 people. "My father learned how to speak again," he continued. "He sat in a night class like a man with nothing in his hands, simply so that one day he could speak properly. And I was the person who told him to be quiet. I won't do that a second time." The smile vanished completely from Sal's face. Bianca Fiore rose from her seat at the opposite end of the table. She didn't cry, shout, or break anything. She merely removed her engagement ring, placed it on the white tablecloth beside the documents, and said just loudly enough to be heard, "I don't think anyone will be signing anything tonight." Then she picked up her purse and walked toward the door, her heels striking the floor at a steady rhythm between the 2 rows of chairs, neither quickly nor slowly, without looking back even once. People began to rise. Chairs scraped across the floor, whispers spread like overflowing water, and someone called for a driver. At some point, the musicians had stopped playing. In less than half an hour, more than half the Fairmount Hotel ballroom had emptied, and those who remained stood in small groups, with their backs turned toward one another, making telephone calls. On the long head table, covered in white linen, surrounded by glasses of wine no one had finished, and the ring lying alone on the fabric, the settlement documents remained open to the final page. The signature line was still blank, and the pen remained exactly where Cassian had placed it, untouched. 2 days after the night at the Fairmount Hotel, Loretta Pike asked Greta to come to her office, and her voice over the telephone sounded completely different from every other time, hesitant and almost cautious. When Greta arrived, Loretta didn't immediately invite her to sit. She stood behind her desk holding a file and explained that, as part of the required procedure before the probate hearing, she had to inventory every personal asset held in the deceased man's name, even the smallest accounts. During that process, she had discovered a fund. It wasn't large. It didn't appear in any of the family's financial records. It had been established through a charitable organization that supported families with deaf children, and throughout all those years, only one person had ever contributed money to it. Loretta placed the file on the desk. "The surname Novak appears on the list of beneficiaries," she said. Greta didn't understand at first. "I have to ask you," Loretta continued, her voice slowing, "because if you ever accepted money from the man whose wishes you certified, the other side will use it to destroy your entire testimony in court. So I need you to tell me the truth. Did you know about this?" Greta shook her head. She pulled the file toward herself and began turning the pages. The first page contained a list of expenditures. She recognized the name of the hearing center where Milo had gone for an examination every summer. She recognized the school her mother had always said was paid for by the state. She found a notation for a hearing device, whose blue case she could still picture clearly. She turned to the next page. There, in the section explaining why the fund had been created, was a brief typed sentence referring to an industrial accident that had occurred many years earlier at the family's steel foundry, along with a list of the families who had received assistance. Greta stopped when she saw the name of the foundry. She had heard that name only once in her life, when she was a child and a neighbor asked her mother where the girl's father worked. Her mother had answered, then immediately changed the subject. From that day forward, no one in their home ever spoke that name again. It wasn't because they had forgotten. It was because her mother wouldn't allow the name to be spoken. Loretta sat in the chair across from her and silently pushed the final page forward. It was a copy of an old, yellowed report documenting an incident the entire city had forgotten long ago. A defective safety component had been reported several times. No one had done anything about it. One worker had died. The case had been closed very quickly. The investigation report could no longer be found, and the dead worker's family had received money for the funeral along with a document promising that they wouldn't pursue a claim. At the bottom of that document was her mother's signature, the familiar slant of the handwriting instantly recognizable to Greta, unchanged from the birthday cards her mother had written to her throughout the years. Greta sat perfectly still. Outside the window, a garbage truck passed, and its noise rolled through the office before fading away. She thought about the man on the 4th floor, about his trembling fingers, struggling to repeat the same sequence of movements until someone finally nodded. She thought about the final 3 weeks of his life. She thought about how, throughout her childhood, whenever anyone in the house accidentally mentioned that family name while it was being spoken on the news, her mother would quietly rise and walk into the kitchen. Then she thought about the final 3 gestures. The right hand placed flat against the left side of the chest, held for 1 beat, then lowered as the palm opened toward the space ahead. A private name sign he had created when his daughter was still very small, for someone his daughter had never met. Tell that person father is sorry. Greta released the paper. She rose halfway before her legs gave way, and she sank onto the carpet in the middle of the office, her back against the leg of the chair, both hands covering her face. Loretta walked around the desk and knelt beside her without asking a single question. For more than 20 years, Greta had grown up in a home where one name was forbidden to be spoken, and for the past 3 weeks, she had sacrificed her job, her safety, and even her sleep to preserve the final words of the very man who bore that name. Greta went straight from the lawyer's office to the hospital. Her mother was sitting propped against the pillows, her hair tied back, reading an old magazine someone had left behind in the waiting room. She looked up and smiled at her daughter, but the smile slowly faded when she saw Greta's face. Greta didn't sit in the chair. She pulled the document from her coat pocket, spread it across the thin blanket covering her mother's legs, directly beneath that familiar slanting signature, and stood there waiting. She had already prepared herself for everything her mother might say. Her mother would narrow her eyes because she couldn't see clearly. She would ask what the paper was. She would be stunned, raise a hand to her mouth, and say that she had never known anything about it. But Danuta Novak glanced down at the document only once, very quickly, then looked up at her daughter, and she wasn't shocked at all. "I knew," she said. Greta stood frozen. "I knew before you were tall enough to reach the windowsill," her mother continued, folding the magazine and setting it aside. "They came to our house one afternoon. 3 people, dressed respectably and speaking politely. They placed an envelope on the kitchen table, right where I always sat preparing vegetables, and they told me not to ask any more questions, not to hire a lawyer, and not to tell anyone. I signed. I took it." Greta's voice broke. "How could you take it?" she said. "How could you take it, Mom? They killed Dad. They knew that machine was broken and didn't repair it. They let him die there, then handed you an envelope, and you took it." Danuta didn't look away from her daughter. She met Greta's eyes, and her voice was so calm that it hurt Greta more deeply than her tears ever could have. "You were 6, she said. "Your brother was 3, and I had just been told that he would never hear. I sat alone in that kitchen with no profession, barely enough English to make myself understood, and no one in this city standing beside me. I had 2 children and exactly 1 envelope." She raised one hand and smoothed a crease in the blanket. "If I hadn't signed, I would have had to sue them. How many years would that have taken? And during those years, your brother would have grown up in silence, with no school, no teacher, and no one to speak to him except you. I made my choice. I sold my dignity to buy your brother a school and a place where people were willing to understand him." She looked at her daughter. "If I had to choose again, Greta, I would still sell it. Greta couldn't say a word. She picked up the document, folded it, and walked out of the room. She heard her mother call her name once from behind, but she didn't turn around. That night, she didn't go home. She walked. She followed the road in front of the hospital, then turned south, passing rows of closed buildings, empty bus stops, and a market that had packed away its stalls long before. She kept walking through the late autumn cold, while the same words struck her mind again and again. She had built her entire life upon an unshakable conviction that her dignity was the one boundary no amount of wealth or power could ever cross. She had spat that truth at the men who placed envelopes on basement tables and pushed blank checks across mahogany desks. She had believed that her integrity was untainted, the one thing in this world nobody could purchase. And now she knew that the person capable of speaking those words had been raised through a bargain. Dawn was slowly breaking when she reached the lake. She sat on a stone bench damp with dew and watched the water change from black to gray. There, in the quietest hour of the day, she understood something she would carry for the rest of her life. Her mother hadn't sold herself. Her mother had paid a price. A seller exchanges something precious for something she wants. But a person who pays a price gives up the most precious thing she possesses to preserve someone else. From the outside, those two acts look exactly the same, and only the person living through them knows which one she is doing. Some prices are paid out of love, not cowardice. Greta rose when the sun came up and boarded the first bus back to the hospital. He was waiting for her in the third-floor hallway, seated in the plastic chair directly outside her mother's room, both hands resting on his knees like a relative waiting for visiting hours to begin. "Sit down," Sal Marchetti said. "My legs ache when I stand too long, and I want to have a proper conversation with you." Greta didn't sit. She leaned against the opposite wall, and inside her coat pocket, her thumb pressed the recording button on her telephone before he had even finished his first sentence. "I know everything about you," he said, his voice warm and measured, the voice of a man who had lulled an entire city to sleep with that very tone. "I know you lost your job. I know how much you owe this hospital. I also know about your elderly neighbor, Mrs. Ruth, who knocks on your door once every week. She's a good woman. It's a shame for someone her age to be living alone in a neighborhood like that." He looked up at the number on the door behind Greta. "Your mother is in this room?" he said. "Special observation. Permission required for anyone entering or leaving." "That's fortunate." Greta didn't move. "What do you want?" she asked. "Only 3 words. Sal said. "When you're in court, and they ask whether you remember exactly what signs he made, all you have to say is, 'I don't remember.' That's all. No one is asking you to lie. Human memory fades. It happens to everyone." He rose and brushed down the front of his coat. "Then everything will go smoothly. Your mother's medical expenses will be covered for the rest of her life. You'll return to work, and I'll arrange a new position for you wherever you choose. Your elderly neighbor can remain exactly where she is, and no one will bother her." He smiled. "I'm not threatening you, my dear. I'm merely showing you which road will be easier to take." Greta looked at him for a long time, her stance unyielding. "Uncle Marchetti," she said, her voice painfully calm, "you've spent your whole life buying people's silence, but you'll find that my memory isn't something your money can erase." Sal's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Everyone plays the hero," he replied, "until they realize what it costs." Greta nodded. "Give me 1 night," she said. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow morning." As he passed her, he lightly patted her shoulder, exactly as he always patted everyone else's, then walked toward the elevator. Greta remained still until the elevator doors had closed completely. Then she pulled the telephone from her pocket. The recording was still running, the seconds continuing to climb at a steady pace. She stopped it, saved it, then sent a copy to Loretta Pike while standing in the middle of the hallway. That same night, on the other side of the city, in a small room behind a warehouse owned by the family, Cassian Barone placed 3 objects on the table: a passport, a one-way airline ticket, an envelope. Rocco Sabatini sat across from him, his large hands resting on his thighs, and he didn't touch any of them. "You keep your life," Cassian said. "You keep your hands and your legs, and you walk out of this room on your own 2 feet. But beginning tomorrow morning, your name will no longer exist in this city. No one will hire you. No one will sell anything to you. No one will remember what you once did for my family. You aren't going to die, Uncle Rocco. You're simply going to be erased." He pushed the passport a little closer. You were the one who taught me that, he said. Back when I wasn't old enough to shave, you told me that if I wanted to remove someone from my life, I shouldn't touch them. I should leave them standing exactly where they were, with nowhere left to go. Rocco looked up. Then he slid from the chair and fell to his knees on the concrete floor, the man who had once lifted Cassian high above the ground. He called Cassian by the name his mother had used when he was a child, the name no one in the world had dared to speak for more than 20 years. He said he had been given no choice. He said promises had been made to him. He said he had carried Cassian in his arms, taught him to ride a bicycle, and waited outside his school for him through more afternoons than either of them could count. Cassian stood looking at him, and not a single muscle moved in his face. 6:10 tomorrow morning, he said. Then he turned away. At the door, he stopped with one hand resting on the frame, but he didn't look back. And when he spoke his final sentence, his voice broke, that familiar, quiet voice splitting in two before the words were finished. You're the last person alive who still remembers what my mother looked like, he said. Then he stepped outside, and the door closed behind him, leaving only an old man kneeling on the concrete floor beside the 3 objects waiting on the table. The next morning, Greta went up to the 3rd floor carrying 2 cups of coffee, one for herself and one for her mother, even though her mother wasn't allowed to drink it and could only smell it. It had been their private joke for months. She pushed open the door to the room. The bed was empty. The blanket had been folded into a neat square. The pillow had a fresh cover, and the small bedside cabinet where her mother always kept the old magazine now showed nothing but a bare wooden surface. All the equipment had been removed. Greta stood in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee in her hands, and for one moment, the first thought that entered her mind was the worst thought any child could have, and it made her knees weaken. She walked back to the nurse's station. The nurse checked the computer, then looked up and spoke in the calm voice of someone reading a perfectly valid entry. Danuta Novak had been discharged the previous night and transferred to a private nursing facility at the family's request, and the file contained all the necessary authorization from a relative. Greta asked to see the document. They printed it for her. At the bottom was a signature bearing her first and last name, written in a hand she had never used once in her life. She told them it wasn't her signature. They told her to remain calm. They told her to call the facility and ask. The number printed on the document rang, then went to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She called the nursing system's main switchboard, and the person on the other end asked her to hold. She waited while the same brief piece of music repeated until it nearly drove her mad. She called the police. The officer on duty took her statement, asked whether she was certain no other relative could have authorized the transfer, then explained that because the paperwork appeared valid, the matter would first have to be verified. How long will that take? Greta asked. No one could give her an answer, and so she stood there in the middle of the 3rd floor hallway, 2 cups of cold coffee resting on the windowsill, with no idea where in the world her mother was. Some stretches of time can't be measured by clocks. Later, when Greta remembered those hours, she wouldn't be able to say how long they lasted. She would remember only that they were the longest hours of her life, longer than all the nights spent beside hospital beds, longer than the day she waited outside the emergency room when she was 20. She walked from one hallway to another, dialed every number again, questioned every person in a medical coat who passed her, and no one knew anything. At last, she sank onto the steps in the emergency stairwell and called him. He answered on the first ring. She managed to speak about 4 sentences before he interrupted, asked for the name of the facility printed on the document, asked what time appeared in the records, then told her not to go anywhere and ended the call. From that moment, Greta had no idea what was happening on the other side of the city. She sat on the stair, clutching her telephone and counting every minute. Near midnight, the telephone vibrated. Cassian had found Danuta at a small nursing home outside the city, a place with a respectable sign and valid licenses, where the staff had admitted her using the forged documents and had no idea what they were truly receiving. He brought her back that same night. Loretta Pike, awakened at 1 o'clock in the morning, sat at her own kitchen table, drafting an emergency request for a court order protecting the witness and the witness's family, and she filed it the moment the courthouse opened. From that night forward, no one could touch Danuta Novak again. When the ambulance brought her back to her old room, Cassian stood in the hallway, his coat draped over one arm, his eyes bloodshot. He watched the bed disappear through the door, then turned to Greta. I just used the very thing my father ordered me to dismantle, he said, his voice harsh and hoarse. I made calls I was never supposed to make again. I did it to save the mother of the woman trying to carry out his final wishes. Do you see how strange life is?" Then he walked away. Greta remained alone on the plastic chair in the hallway beneath the ceiling light that never went dark. And in that final silence, the thing she had managed to hold together for so many days finally broke apart. She took her notebook from her bag, tore out a page, and began to write. She wrote in her own hand, clearly and without corrections, the exact words that had been typed for her on that first night in the basement. She wrote that she wasn't certain of what she had interpreted. She wrote that she was withdrawing her certification. When she finished, she read it once, folded the page into quarters, and placed it in her coat pocket. All her life, she had said she wasn't something that could be bargained over. It turned out that she had a price too. Until now, no one had ever offered the one thing she truly needed. The next morning, Greta entered her mother's room with the paper folded into quarters, still resting in her coat pocket. She had planned to tell her mother that everything would soon be over, that she could rest without worrying, that her daughter had found a way. Greta had practiced those words in the elevator. Danuta was sitting propped against the pillows, and when she saw her daughter enter, she gestured toward the bedside cabinet, where they kept a pad of notes and a pen for the days when she was too exhausted to speak aloud. Greta took them down and handed them to her mother. Danuta placed the pad on her lap and picked up the pen. Then she stopped. She set the pen down, pushed the paper aside, and raised both hands. Greta watched, unable to understand what her mother intended to do. Then Danuta brought the fingers of her right hand together, raised them to chest level, and began to move. Slowly, very slowly. Her fingers trembled, and the joints swollen from years of dialysis no longer allowed her to do anything quickly. She made a mistake on the second gesture and had to stop, lower her hands, then begin again from the start. "You aren't to blame for Milo." Greta couldn't breathe. She stood rooted to the floor in the middle of the room, both arms hanging at her sides, watching as her mother repeated the sequence to be certain, clumsy as a child and focused as someone crossing a bridge. During all 17 years of Milo's life, her mother had never learned a single sign. Not one. Greta had been the person sitting between them, interpreting from mother to son, and then from son to mother, day after day, ever since she was so small that she had to stand on her toes to reach the dining table. Danuta lowered her hands, breathing a little heavily, then picked up the pen and wrote, her familiar slanting script trembling across the small sheet of paper. "I began learning the day your brother left us. I went to an afternoon class they offered for elderly people. I learned very slowly. It took me so long to remember." She pushed the note toward her daughter, then continued writing on a second page. "I didn't learn so I could speak to anyone. Your brother is gone. There's no one left for me to speak to. I learned only so that one day I could tell you this in the language you understand better than any other language in the world." Greta sank onto the edge of the bed. Danuta raised one hand and placed it on her daughter's head, a gesture she hadn't made since Greta was a child. Then she withdrew her hand and wrote a third note, more slowly this time, stopping twice before she reached the end. "I let you carry the burden that should have been mine. You were too young, and I was too tired. You went to work that afternoon because I told you to go. Do you remember? I told you to go, that I was home and everything would be all right. All these years, you've believed you came home too late. You didn't, my child. It wasn't your fault. It was never your fault." Greta bent forward and buried her face in the thin blanket covering her mother's knees, and she wept like someone who had held something inside for 7 years without ever allowing herself to set it down. Danuta said nothing more. She simply placed her trembling hand on her daughter's hair and kept it there for a very long time, until Greta's shoulders stopped shaking. When Greta finally looked up, her eyes swollen and red, her mother smiled and repeated the sequence once more. This time, she performed nearly every sign correctly, making only one mistake at the very end. Greta took both her mother's hands, corrected her, then let her try again. "You aren't to blame for Milo." "That's right," Greta said, her voice breaking. "You did it right." She remained there for a long while, until her mother drifted to sleep. Then Greta rose, pulled the blanket up around her shoulders, and walked outside. In the hallway, beneath the ceiling light that never went dark, Greta reached into her coat pocket and removed the paper folded into quarters. She opened it and read once more the words she had written the night before. Then she tore it in half, tore it into quarters, and kept tearing until nothing remained in her palm but fragments. She dropped every piece into the trash can at the end of the hallway before walking toward the elevator. The probate courtroom was packed. Sal Marchetti sat in the front row with his hands folded over his stomach, and as Greta walked past, he smiled at her with the familiar smile of a kindly uncle. His attorney rose first, and he wasted no time on anything indirect. He asked Greta where the handwritten report she had prepared at the scene that night was now. Greta answered that it had been removed from the hospital records safe. The attorney nodded thoughtfully, turned toward the courtroom, then told the judge that the witness was asking the court to trust the memory of someone who had spent the past several weeks coming and going from the home of one of the parties in the dispute, eating there, moving freely through the house, without a single document created at the time of the event to support her claims. He said that the so-called final passage might very well have appeared in her memory only after she became acquainted with the Barone family. Whispers spread through the courtroom. Greta stood with both hands resting on the edge of the witness stand, and she knew that, as a matter of form, he was right. Then a man rose from the final row of seats. Dale Pruitt walked up the center aisle carrying an old plastic document case and asked permission to make a statement in his capacity as the person responsible for the hospital records system. He explained that under hospital storage procedures, every handwritten report prepared at a patient's bedside was scanned into the server during the same shift, and that each scan carried an electronic timestamp applied automatically by the system that no one could alter. He submitted a printed copy, along with the access logs. In the corner of the scanned page were the words Greta had written in her own hand that night, stating that the final passage consisted of private family signs and required verification by someone from the household. The timestamp clearly showed that it had been written that same night, many weeks before Greta ever set foot inside the Barone home. The opposing attorney sprang to his feet and objected. The judge asked Dale why he had waited until today to produce it. Dale remained silent for a moment, then admitted that he had sold Greta's work schedule to them, had given them the access code to the basement door, and had accepted exactly the amount of money he needed. He went on to say that Greta knew everything, that she had come all the way to the parking lot to confront him, and that she hadn't reported him. She had only told him that if the day ever came when he wanted to give back what he had taken, he would know where to find her. "Today, I'm giving it back," Dale said, his voice trembling. The entire room fell silent. The judge admitted the evidence into the record. The next person to approach was Bianca Fiore. She was dressed in black and spoke briefly and clearly, stating that the engagement between her and Cassian Barone hadn't been a matter of love but a contractual term, that her father had traded it for a share in the port development agreement, and that the person who had conducted every negotiation and drafted all of those terms was Sal Marchetti. When she finished, she looked at Sal only once, then returned to her seat. Then it was Nadia's turn. She approached the witness stand with Greta, and the opposing attorney immediately rose, his voice shifting into the tone people used when they wanted to appear compassionate toward someone. He said that he had the utmost respect for Miss Barone. But, Your Honor, this witness couldn't hear, while every discussion the opposing side had referred to had been spoken aloud behind closed doors, and he genuinely couldn't understand what she intended to testify about. Nadia raised her hands. Greta interpreted each sentence clearly, adding nothing and leaving nothing out. "I was forced to learn lip reading before I was tall enough to reach that table. I sat in those rooms for years, in the corner, with a notebook on my lap. You never hid your faces or watched your words in front of me. Not once. Because you believed that without a voice, I couldn't understand." The opposing attorney opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. The judge asked Nadia why she had never told anyone throughout all those years. Nadia raised her hands, and Greta interpreted. "Who was I supposed to tell? My entire family spoke in front of me as though they were speaking in front of a chair. No one asks a chair what it heard." The judge asked the witness to state her name for the record. The clerk seated below had her pen ready, looked up, and said she would enter the witness's name for her. Greta didn't respond to the clerk. She turned to Nadia, took the young woman's hand, and signed one brief question. "Would you like to say it yourself?" Nadia looked at her. Then she looked down at her own hands, looked out across the courtroom filled with people who had once spoken in front of her as though they were speaking in front of a chair, and rose to her feet. She opened her mouth. The sound that emerged was distorted, the vowels stretched and sliding out of place, the final consonants disappearing, and it was loud, far too loud for that room, the volume of someone who had never heard her own voice, and therefore didn't know what was enough. "My name is Nadia Barone." No one moved. The clerk set down her pen. In the second row, Cassian lowered his head into his hands and remained that way for a very long time. Then the hearing continued, and Greta began recreating each sequence of movements she had recorded in her notebook, slowly and exactly as she had seen them in the fourth-floor room that night, while Nadia stood beside her and interpreted. The first sequence, Nadia translated, and her words came through the court interpreter with perfect clarity. "You aren't my shame. You're the only thing I ever did right." When she finished, she had to stop and raise one hand to cover her mouth, and the judge waited for her. The second sequence, Nadia translated it one part at a time. Documents. The old house. The bench people sit on when they play the piano. The one with a lid that opens. Underneath it. Loretta Pike's attorney immediately asked the court for permission to seal the property and conduct an examination, and the judge granted the request that same morning. Then Greta performed the final sequence. The right hand placed flat against the left side of the chest, held for one beat, then lowered as the palm opened toward the space ahead. Nadia translated, "Tell that person Father is sorry." The entire courtroom heard it. No one understood why. People looked at one another, waiting for a name, waiting for an explanation, but none came. There was only an apology suspended in the middle of a hearing about property, and no one knew to whom it had been sent. Only one person in the room knew. Greta stood there with her hands still partly raised, and she finally understood what she had sensed from the moment she sank onto the floor of the lawyer's office. The hospital hadn't called her that night by grand design, but by a stroke of quiet fate. He hadn't known who she was when she walked into that room. For 3 weeks, he had simply been repeating that nameless apology to anyone who would listen, desperate to send it out into the world before he died, and fate had brought the victim's daughter right to his bedside to receive it. Not because she was a better interpreter than anyone else, but because of everything that remained from his entire life. The one thing he wanted to do with his final breaths was look directly into the face of that worker's daughter and say what he had kept silent for more than 20 years. He had created that private sign years ago, when reviewing the accident files, a symbol representing the orphaned child of the worker he had failed. He never knew her face, but he carried her ghost in his hands until his final breath. Greta began to weep in the middle of the courtroom. She remained standing at the witness stand, neither wiping her face nor sitting down. The judge called a 10-minute recess. When the hearing resumed, Loretta Pike submitted the recording of the conversation in the third-floor hallway, and the entire room sat in silence, as it listened to the warm voice of a kindly uncle mention an elderly neighbor, refer to the room number in the special observation unit, and say that only 3 words were required. Along with the recording came the discharge documents bearing the forged signature and the hospital's verification report. Sal Marchetti remained sitting upright in the front row until the final sentence. Then 2 men in plain clothes rose from the last row, walked up the center aisle, and spoke several words to him so quietly that even the people sitting nearby couldn't hear them. He stood. No one shouted. Nothing broke. There was only the sound of handcuffs closing. One small, precise click, and it echoed through the silent courtroom. Outside the courthouse, after nearly everyone had gone home, Cassian handed Greta a set of documents that had already been signed. She opened them and read, and they transferred his entire inheritance to her without conditions or obligations. "My father took your father from you," he said. "I'm giving it back. This is everything I have." Greta read every page, closed the file, and pushed it back toward him. "I'm not something that can be bargained over," she said, "even when the person doing the bargaining is trying to do something kind." He stood motionless for a moment. "Then what do you want from me?" he asked. "Attend the evening sign language class at the community center on Kedzie Street," she replied. "The same class your father attended. That's the only thing you owe me." Cassian turned toward Nadia, who was standing beside them. He raised both hands and made 3 gestures, slowly and with the grammar wrong, one hand getting tangled with the other. "I'm sorry, your brother is here." Nadia burst into tears and wrapped her arms around him in the middle of the courthouse hallway. The following afternoon, Greta went to Rose Hill Cemetery. She sat before the small headstone, brushed the dry leaves from its surface, and raised her hands, speaking to her brother in the language the 2 of them had invented on their front steps so many years ago. "That day, I came too late. I'm sorry. But today, I arrived on time, Milo." Cassian stood about 10 paces away with his hands in his pockets. He didn't approach or say anything. He simply waited until she was finished. In the months and years that followed, everything changed. Cassian voluntarily cooperated with investigators and revealed the entire system his family had spent 3 generations building. He accepted his sentence and remained under legal supervision for many years without trying to evade a single condition. The port was sold. Every illegitimate part of the business was completely dissolved. When everything was over, he began again with a small, legitimate construction company employing only a dozen or so workers, and he drove himself to the job site every morning. The ledgers discovered beneath the piano bench in the old house resolved the remaining parts of the case. The court recognized the will. The fund it established paid for Danuta Novak's kidney transplant, and by the following spring, she could walk to the park at the end of the block on her own. Dale Pruitt's daughter also recovered and returned to school. 2 years later, the Milo Novak Language Center opened in Avondale, inside a single-story building with large glass doors facing the street. The center offered free sign language instruction to families with deaf children. It taught parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters, and anyone else who wanted to learn. On opening day, children ran around the room, their laughter filling the entire building as they competed to guess words formed by one another's hands and squealed whenever they answered correctly. Nadia served as the coordinator, standing among the children with her hands unable to speak quickly enough. Mrs. Ruth sat in the front row and wiped her eyes with a handkerchief throughout the ceremony. Cassian arrived a little late and stood at the back of the room like an ordinary man, with no car waiting outside and no one accompanying him. After the crowd had thinned, he walked over to Greta. "I want to ask you something," he said, and this time he truly asked before doing anything. "May I take you to dinner?" Greta looked at him, then smiled. "I'm not something that can be bargained over," she said, "but I am someone who can be invited. There's a very important difference." Greta Novak's story ends there, and perhaps the most memorable part isn't the courtroom or everything that collapsed, but something far simpler. Throughout life, people are measured by their clothing size, their title, and the amount of money in their bank account. But what truly defines a person is the one thing they refuse to sell, even when the price rises very high. And there is one gift every one of us can offer another person without spending a single dollar. We can sit down, wait, and listen until the person before us has finished speaking. Perhaps someone near you is waiting for that gift right now. An elderly father who seldom speaks, a shy grandchild, or a neighbor who lives alone. Sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to understand, and an entire life can be saved. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening to compelling stories together every day. And don't forget to share it so that others can hear it too. How did this story make you feel? Which moment moved you the most? Please leave a comment below. We sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.